Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergey Lavrov, has kick-started his two-day visit to Beijing at the invitation of his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. And according to the latest news coming in, both of the nations have expressed support for a summit of permanent members of the UN Security Council. Now, the visit has been aimed at discussing what both parties call dominance of Western ideological agenda. The discussions mainly centered around the United States and its latest actions concerning both Russia and China. As the meet comes immediately after the conclusion of talks between Foreign Minister Yi and the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Alaska, both the leaders issued a press release at the end of the meeting. Now, the two foreign ministers have addressed the issue of global peace and how the international community believes that the United States should reflect on the damage it has caused to it. And they have also called on the United States to halt the unilateral bullying and have warned against meddling in other countries' domestic affairs. Both the nations have urged the U.S. to stop forming small circles to seek bloc confrontation and stop unilateral sanctions.
The more unstable the world is, it is more necessary for China and Russia to work together. For a long period of time, the West, including the U.S., using democracy and human rights as a cover, wantonly interfered in other countries' affairs and caused a lot of trouble over the world, even seeding conflict and turmoil. China and Russia has always stood together in close cooperation and against hegemony and bullying in the world. We've become a pillar for world peace and stability.
Bolstering Chinese-Russian bilateral ties and addressing international and regional issues of common concerns are the top agendas on the table. It's expected that today's meetings might conclude with an agreement that signals Moscow's and Beijing's interest in furthering cooperation and strengthening coordination on security affairs. Now, they might discuss reinforcing common positions on matters concerning human rights in Iran and Myanmar. Remember, the meeting comes at a crucial time, especially after Biden administration's Asian debut. Beijing is interested in ensuring that President Joe Biden's attempt to strengthen ties with the Quad and shift NATO priorities are met with a stronger Sino-Russian relationship. Now, WION correspondent Julia Chapman is joining us live from Moscow for more on this. Good evening to you, Julia. It's great to have you on the broadcast. Now, this boosting of Chinese-Russian bilateral ties and addressing international and regional issues of common concerns for the two countries are expected to be discussed. What is Russia looking for from this meet?
Well, this meeting really underscores the growing warmth between Russia and China, the growing cooperation between the two countries that has been developing for the last few years, particularly as both countries become more and more isolated from the West, finding themselves the targets of sanctions and criticism of their respective actions on the world stage and indeed domestically as well. Not least, most recently, last week, there were, of course, some very tense meetings between the Chinese and US sides in Alaska last week, and also Russia recalled its ambassador to Washington, a very unusual move that hasn't been used since 1998, and that came after President Joe Biden said that he believed President Vladimir Putin was a killer. So the relations between the US and Russia and the US and China increasingly strained, and this visit of Sergey Lavrov's to China immediately after the talks in Alaska really underscores how important Russia has become as a sounding board for Beijing, but also vice versa. Russia really increasingly dependent on Beijing as a partner and as an economic trading partner as well. So not just politically, but also trying to grow trade between Russia and China is becoming an increasing priority for Russia.
Right. Let's unpack this a bit more. You have touched on it. They will, of course, be addressing what both parties call the dominance of Western ideological agenda. And as you said, the meeting is directly after the China-US talks in Alaska. What do you think will be most important here?
So the foreign ministers have been talking about ways that their countries can become less dependent on the West, not least in terms of dollarization. They've been discussing for many years now about moving away from using the US dollar in international trade between Russia and China and a number of other countries. They've also been talking in the last couple of days about moving away from Western payment systems, so really trying to protect themselves from any kind of sanctions that would be denominated in US dollars. And that's been a big move that Russia and China have been focusing on in recent years. But yes, also politically, it's very important for this meeting to happen symbolically to show the West effectively that Russia and China have allies. They don't necessarily need friends in the West. Of course, we've also heard from the EU this week criticizing both countries, inflicting sanctions on individuals in Russia and China for human rights abuses, which both Russia and China deny, of course. But increasingly, it's becoming very difficult for Russia and China to maintain relations with the West, and they're trying to prove that they don't need the West anymore. They have each other.
Right, and one more thing before I let you go. Both nations have expressed an interest in a summit of permanent members of the UN Security Council. What do we make of this interest?
That's right, they have been calling for this, and this comes off the back of the basically growing tensions with the United States that are becoming increasingly urgent from both perspectives. As much as they try to paint this picture of not requiring any dependence on the West, they're also very keen to show that they won't tolerate certain criticisms that emerge from that part of the world, and that's why they have said it's very important for there to be a UN Security Council meeting that is held as soon as possible. There are also some human rights issues that they want to raise. They've been discussing those as well in the last couple of days. Other topics that they've touched upon in their discussions while Sergey Lavrov has been visiting China include the Iran nuclear deal. Both China and Russia are big proponents of that and are trying to get Iran back into compliance after the US withdrew from that deal. So lots of issues that really need to be raised at the highest platforms of international cooperation, and that's among what they want to see discussed at the UN Security Council.
Julia, thanks very much for bringing us all the details and the latest there. WION, now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.